There are many ways people listen to Vision, including DAB+ digital radio.
If you're in Greater Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane and have a digital radio receiver in your car or home, you'll find Vision Christian Radio on the station list. If you're visiting one of these cities and hiring a car, there's a good chance it will have a DAB receiver, and you'll be able to enjoy Vision with exceptional sound quality while you drive around. If you don't already own a DAB receiver, you'll find many models, including clock radios, at electronic retailers for under $100. To find out more about Vision on digital radio and whether you're within the broadcast footprint, see vision.org.au/DAB.
However, and wherever you listen to Vision, you can be sure that the announcers, programs and music will help you look to God daily. A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Stephen McAlpine is an award-winning Christian author, pastor and national commentator for City Bible Forum. Today, he's going to be talking to us about a resurgence of God talk by people all over the world. Stephen McAlpine, I'd like to welcome you now.
Good to be with you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure, Stephen. Now, we're calling today's topic the resurgence of God talk. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I guess in one sense I'm saying it flies in the face of some of the stats that say church is in decline, that church attendance is in decline. But at the same time, what we're noticing is that over the last 20 years, there was the sense that the new atheist conversation would eventually dull down a lot of the God talk. But we're seeing a resurgence of it, not just among people, friends and things like that, but you're seeing it at a level across social media, across intellectuals, and across pop cultural people as well. There's certainly a sense that the idea that Richard Dawkins said, don't worry, there's probably not a God, so don't worry about your life and get on with it, things and get on with it. That's not happening. Things have changed and you're starting to see some conversations coming back into the fore, which is a good sign.
Well, it's encouraging, and it reminds me of many times in history. I think it was Voltaire, the famous philosopher, who once claimed that the Bible would no longer be read by the end of his lifetime. And it's said, I haven't verified this, that his home was turned into a Bible printing centre by the Swiss Bible Society. But even more recently in America, I think in the early part of the 19th century, around 1820 region, there were students on some of the top universities, either Yale or Harvard, I should say, burning Bibles, declaring that the Bible was no longer going to be a part of American society. And then we had the Second Great Awakening after that. So do you feel there is a resurgence of faith coming to the West?
I do, and I guess anecdotally you say that, and as you see things, but as what you pointed out there is that history, when you stretch history out and you look a bit more historically, you go, well, there have been waves, and a narrative that says, well, history is moving in a sort of progressive post-God idea and will become more sort of, there's this great utopian sort of non-religious framework. That's been there all the time. And what I've noticed is that historians, people like Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man. If you're under 30, you're thinking Spider-Man. If you're over 35, you're probably thinking the historian. He's not a Christian, but he says history shows that Christianity changed the world, and there's a resurgence of it. And there's an interest among people like that. What has Christianity done in the world, and what might it continue to do? And if you look at the slice of time we live in now, you might say, well, Christianity's done. But history doesn't show things work out as smoothly as that.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, I mean, there's that famous story, and I'm not going to do her name any justice. Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Hirsi Ali, yeah.
Please say it the way it's supposed to be said in case she's listening. Ayaan, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, but you say it, Stephen. How do we say her name?
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, yeah.
Awesome pronunciation there. Well done. Yep.
She's a very famous intellectual around the world. She was Muslim, then she became an atheist, and she was friends with Richard Dawkins. And she had an article not that long ago, a very public article, Why I'm Now a Christian. And her reason wasn't so much that, she'd fallen in love with Jesus. And I'm just being slightly facetious saying that. But she looked at the cultural frame she was living in. She looked at the way the world was put together, and she started to think, Christianity makes sense of this world. I'll start going to church. So she started dipping her toe in that. And she says herself, I'm very early on in that journey. But I guess people come to the gospel and come to Jesus from different perspectives. And if you're an intellectual, a public intellectual, hey, no surprise, God reaches you through intellectual means as well. But if you're someone like Russell Brand, if you think of the flip side of the public intellectual as the public comedian, but he's also a very smart man. And his journey from a bad boy, and he would have called himself the prodigal, has been interesting, where he's much more forming himself towards a perspective of Jesus. Maybe not quite there yet, but he's certainly looking at the cross of Jesus as central to what life's about. Those are conversations that filter down into the rest of culture, because they are culturally important people who shape conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Russell Brand story is interesting because, as you said, he's very intelligent. I mean, forgetting his faith, I heard him talk about the West recently and just the way society is, and I felt he summarized the modern West in a few short sentences like I've never heard anyone else able to articulate it. I was very drawn to what he was saying. And as you said, I mean, really, the modern world says if you can make money, if you can be famous, if you're a male, you've got a lot of girlfriends, really life should be as good as it can get. And he certainly had all of that, and yet still, like you said, had that void in his heart, and he's found a faith and he's on a journey. And it is, for me, very encouraging.
Oh, look, I also think what I like about that kind of character is that the court jester in the days of, the medieval days could get away with saying a lot to the king, that the king wouldn't hear from anyone else. You get head chopped off. But the court jester could say it. And people like Russell Brand, he's the court jester that's going, hey, the emperor's got no clothes, the cultural emperor, what's going on here? And in one sense, he's saying, I've tried it all, I've had it all, and it's left me hollow. And that's a classic trope for many people, isn't it? They've tried it all. You see Jim Carrey saying that, if anyone who thinks that money's going to solve your problems, let me tell you, it doesn't do it. And it's those voices that people are starting to listening to that say there's something in our culture that's not right, that's not clicking. Maybe this Christian stuff is something to go going for it. I've seen that in a lot of different places. Yeah,
and even some of my childhood heroes who are no longer famous for the younger generation, but Sylvester Stallone, Mr. T, and MC Hammer all have also professed a faith in Jesus in the last few years, which is really encouraging because, again, these guys were at the top of their game in their different spheres of acting and entertainment. And for them now, later in life, to be saying, you know what, Jesus is now my Lord and Saviour, it is very encouraging, very encouraging.
Yeah, and Chris Pratt doesn't get any kudos in Hollywood for saying that he believes in Jesus, does he? I mean, you don't say it these days unless you really do, right? Because at the top level of culture, there's still a certain hostility towards the Christian faith. But I would say that one of the things that Mark Sayers, Australian commentator Mark Sayers, says is that in our Western culture, the experience bucket is full. You can do anything you want, but the meaning and purpose bucket is becoming empty. And that's when people start to ask questions. I notice that in conversations with friends who aren't Christian. They ask questions, and I always say this: runners tell you that they run, so you don't need to find out. But I have a lot of running friends, and you get to talking on running while you're running, and they have, in the quiet moments, they have questions. They want to know stuff, and I find that encouraging. Just not at the popular, famous level, but at the grassroots level as well.
You must be running a lot of kilometres for people to be having deep conversations with you on runs. It sounds like you're running more than I am. But
look, sport does that though, doesn't it? Because there's the thing; it opens you up to other conversations, and any sport does it, I think.
And look, I think and moving beyond just the sport, I think in the modern world, which, as you said, it is devoid of meaning. Sadly, in big cities now, it's devoid of community. I think sport is a great way to build community. And as Christians, I think sport, and whether that be a gym or a club or an individual sport you play, it's one of the best ways we actually can build bridges into non-Christians' lives, isn't it?
100%. Look, I wrote in my new book, Future Proof, that one of the chapters is on polarisation and loneliness, and that one of the issues we're facing in the culture is 1/3 of Australian households are single dwelling now. That's incredible. And that's set to rise with less people settling down, marrying and having children, the whole Tinder thing. And I think the wave, people say the tide of Christianity's gone out. Well, sure enough, it has. Tide's come back, right? And so You have to watch for that. And there will always be signs and signals of it. And I think the people who aren't necessarily Christian have no skin and who have no skin in the game are those you should watch. People like Douglas Murray, who's an English commentator, people like Tom Holland, who are saying, hey, there's something about Christianity that shaped us in a way we probably will miss if we let it go. And those are the voices that people start to listen to. And then, of course, you've got Christian commentators like Glenn Scrivener and Justin Brearley, whose podcast, The Surprising, Rebirth, Return of the Belief in God. It's surprising in one level, but at another level, as you look at history, perhaps not so surprising.
Yeah, and I guess, so where do we go from here, Stephen? Like, for all of our listeners across Australia right now listening to this conversation, what do you think we should do as believers now to perhaps facilitate this resurgence of God talk among people?
Yeah, well, that's always the big question I say whenever I write anything is, how does the church respond to that? How do we as Christians respond? The Bible always says, be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within you. Right? And I think in the current culture, we're a little bit scared to say we're Christian because, like Mike Tyson says, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. And it feels hostile, right? But if you're gracious and good and kind in the way you live and the way you speak to people, you won't always get a hearing and people won't always like you and people will often think that Christianity is part of the problem. But there will be people. There will always be people who say there's something different about the way you're living and what you believe. And the Christian community can model that when it does it well. And I think if people lack in community, it's a very fractured world. When they see that there's a community that is brought together by nothing more and nothing less than who Jesus is, there's diverse people in the Christian community, that's quite compelling in the current climate, I think. And having non-Christian people engage with your Christian friends on a casual basis, that's critical to it, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And I from my personal experience, I think, like you said, there's so many lonely people that if we just take someone from work out or a neighbour or someone we come in contact with who's not a believer, have a coffee with them and just listen to them, I don't think there's a lot of non-Christians out there that actually have anyone listen to them because everyone's talking today and no one's listening. And just by being a listener, we can really build bridges into people's worlds, can't we?
Yeah, look, my wife is a clinical psychologist, and what's happened, I think, is somehow a lot of listening's been outsourced to people who are paid to listen because we don't listen very well. And she was speaking about this recently, that listening is an act of love. To listen, because what we're all doing is waiting for you to shut up so I can say my next thing, right? And I'm guilty, Your Honour, because I'm like that. And my wife's telling me that actually listening is an act of love, and to do that for people who are hurting or asking questions is very compelling. And to be a good listener is something that God wants Christians to be. And one of the things I'd say is that often our apologetics was, in the past as Christians, has been, I've got answers for you now. And one of the things I've learned over the past few years is to ask the question that's sitting behind the question. When someone comes at you maybe in a hostile way, you can say, oh, why are you asking that? What's been going on for you that you would ask that? Rather than pounce with his 5-point answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I used to be a sales trainer, and the worst salespeople are the salespeople who talk too much. The best salespeople ask questions, listen, find out what the customer wants or the client wants, then identify the products or services they have that match that need. And that is a far better approach to selling. But the traditional perception of people is that salespeople are great talkers, but I actually believe good salespeople are great listeners. And the old saying, leaders are listeners. So does your wife, the clinical psychologist, does she like to school you up on how to be a better listener? Can you share with our listeners some hot tips on how to be a good listener?
Well, she looks at me sometimes, she said, pause before you say anything, and then in your mind go, what's the question that person's asking behind that question? And she said, this is interesting because she used it as an example. I have a twin brother, and he knew Sir George Martin, the producer of the Beatles, right? And this is a few years ago, before Sir George died. And he said one of the interesting things about Sir George Martin was he was the most famous person who would ever come into any room, but he was interested in you. And part of listening, the first thing is that you're interested in that other person. And that you can come out of a room where someone has listened to you and say, that person was really smart, they had lots of good things to say, and you realise actually They asked me more stuff. And I think as Christians, we get nervous because of Christianity, the spot it's in, and we start to gabble. And I think, just dial it back. God's with you in this moment. Have a listen to what people are asking. See what the issue behind the issue is. And that's what my wife would say in a clinical setting, but she also says in an evangelistic setting, start listening to what people are actually saying. And that's a good place to start.
Yeah, well, you can tell your wife you're a good student because you've just modelled that to us now. And, while you were talking, I was just thinking, if you think about it, God is the ultimate listener, isn't he? I mean, he's listening to prayers all day, every day. And sadly, a lot of his people don't even listen to him. And yet he just has this listening ear for us all. And we just sort of expect God to listen. And as you said, I think to be Christ-like, it's a servant role where you just go into a conversation or a meeting with someone as the listener, as the receiver of the information, not the giver of the information. And I just know myself, when someone really listens to me, I just feel so touched. And again, there's unbelievers out there right now that no one is listening to them. They are not being heard. They're not feeling any sense of significance. And as Christians, we can step into that void, can't we?
Yeah, we can. And look, the church network I'm involved with has got a program called Taste and See, which is like 4 gospel meals, going through the Bible in 4 different meals. And people are signing up to it and asking lots of questions and wanting to know stuff. And I think it's in a place where you can have food together and share, where you're not necessarily in the position of power, but you're in the position where you're all seated at the table. Tables are good places for listening. There are also places where we risk listening because, shouting over the top of each other. But when Christians can get together with other people who are not, and they start to have table fellowship, I think it's a good place for listening. And those conversations are coming to the fore. Now, I think the church is, future-proof. That's what I'd say. But how we go forward as a church in the next 30 years as we shape into this very different culture might mean that we dial some of the loudness back a little bit and start to listen a bit more.
Yeah, hey, that's good preaching, Stephen. I'm listening to you, brother. I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you. Now, back to some fairly well-known people who are pronouncing faith. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but originally from Brisbane swimmer Stephanie Rice, the Olympic swimmer, she's actually professed a faith in the last couple of months. And I don't want to put too much pressure on her because she's only a new believer. But, again, amazing story. A girl that had the world at her feet and is really a household name in Australia 2 months ago had the guts to come out on Instagram. And I don't know if you've seen the video. There's a video of her being water baptized and praying on her knees like a little handmaiden of the Lord there. I mean, it is encouraging, isn't it?
It is. And, for her to actually do that once again, there's no credit from the culture from doing it. And I saw a bit of pushback against her. Oh, is she safe? And I'm going, she's probably the safest she's ever been. Because in one sense, the cliche is that you get all the gold and then you realise that all that glitters is not gold, right? And you realise that you run or swim for a crown that won't last. And suddenly she's got the perfect story of she's got the gold crown of the world, and suddenly she realises that's not enough and it can't last and you can't relive that glory and it fades. I think that's always the point in your life that C.S. Lewis says it, that God whispers in our pleasures but he shouts in our pain, that suffering and pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world, and that whether that's actual suffering or it's existential suffering, someone like Stephanie Rice has experienced the highs and lows and realised that's not enough. And, she is a young Christian, so we don't want to put it on her. We just want to say, let her find her space to figure that out, I think. Yeah,
and let her grow in her faith. But just going back to your earlier points about culture and how there's a resurgence of God talk, do you think also this should encourage us as believers to pray for the Western world, for God to really shake up the world and bring his gospel to the forefront again?
Well, if we don't pray, what we're saying is all the power is in us to try and shape and change everything. But it's actually not. And God is delighted to answer the prayers that he wants to see answered, right? He wants to see people saved. And perhaps we haven't prayed as we ought. And perhaps we've just gotten angry or frustrated or despairing about the culture. But God looks at it like Nineveh. Here's people that don't know the right hand from their left. Don't be a grumpy Jonah, or don't run away, or don't despise these people. And I often say, we look for the low-hanging fruit to become Christian. What if God says, get a ladder and go up the tree? There's a lot of people that you'd be very surprised to become Christian, like a Zacchaeus, like the woman at the well. Like all those stories in the Bible should tell you that cultural people who are way away from God can become Christians. Surely it tells you that, and pray for it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was actually talking about this on Sunday in a church here in Brisbane about when Wesley, and I think Whitfield was there, but the Wesley brothers were there, and I think it was Aldersgate Lane in London. They were just these young Oxford University students, some of the most brilliant minds in the world at that time, not just in England, but in the world. Mm-hmm. And they're praying and praying and praying all night for God to move in their nation. It's such an inspiring story. And of course, from there, we had this revival in both Great Britain and in North America from the Wesley brothers and from Whitfield. And it all started in a prayer meeting in that Aldersgate Lane in London.
Yeah, look, I say, pray for one person in your sphere and see what happens. And, add in everyone else who you don't know. But start doing that and start to see what happens. Because in one sense, what I say is I put on my glasses and I go, put on your Arnie Terminator 2 glasses when he goes into a place and he scans the room to see where people are at, I go, just do that. Walk around and go, I wonder what's going on in that person's life. Could I pray for them? And just sort of scan it. And I think God does work there, right?
I love your pop culture illustrations, and I love your Mike Tyson quote too. That is the best quote. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. Not many people know that one. That's really good. But Stephen McAlpine, you got any final thoughts for us today about God Talk before we move on?
Yeah, I would say keep it natural. Keep it just talk as if God is real. You don't have to make him abstract. You don't have to intellectualize him. Just talk about him as he's real. And some people will mock you for that, but other people will be intrigued because it's not the craziest thing that people in this world believe, by the way. There's lots of other stuff out there. So talk about it as if it's real, and I think that works. Yeah, amen. Hey, very refreshing, so good, and really motivating for me to keep praying for unbelievers and reaching out for unbelievers. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've got a website. It's Stephen, and that's with a PH. Stephen McAlpine, and that's an MC. Very funky name, by the way, McAlpine. It's sort of like this mixture of Scandinavia and Scotland. Stephen McAlpine, McAlpine.com. And also you work for and with the City Bible Forum, which is citybibleforum.org. But Stephen, I really want to thank you for your contribution today and just for inspiring our listeners all across Australia to pray, reach out to people and be great listeners so we can see a resurgence of God Talk in Australia and beyond our shores even. Great. Thanks very much. Great to be with you today.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.